Well, good morning. We're glad you're with us today. Hope that you've had a good week, and we're going to continue today in a topic that probably you haven't heard anything about. If you have, you may have heard all the wrong things. I don't know. It may still be the same way. Let me ask you this question. Look at those two bills. There's a $20 bill and a $100 bill. How do you tell if they're genuine or not? Well, what's that? The paper? Okay. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, well, we've had that problem here at church. We've had somebody inadvertently give us a $100 bill that didn't pass the bank, let's put it that way. Yeah. Oh, Canadian money all the time, yeah. So conversion rates will kill you, so. How do you know it's genuine? Okay. Okay. It's got these threads through it. What's interesting about this is stage money. It's what they use in movies. They got to make it look authentic. So, do you see the Chinese characters right there? You think that's real? You see it? That tells them it's stage money. The other thing is on 100, right down there in that orange piece, that orange piece has a hologram that says, not for legal tender, stage money. It looks exactly the same, but it just has some different feel to it. That's what we're going to kind of look at today as we look at this. In 1985, there was a group of guys going around. Robert Funk started it, called the Jesus Seminar. They played to a lot of towns and a lot of cities and a lot of arenas. And a lot of people caught on. By the 1990s, they became almost... Robert Funk taught at the University of Chicago, but he was more famous for the Jesus Seminar, the purpose of which was to say, what we don't know about Jesus is important. And we really don't know about Jesus from the Gospel because that gave us a warped sense of who Jesus was. So who really was Jesus? That's the whole point of the Jesus Seminar. It caught on because all of a sudden people started thinking, well, do we have the complete picture of Jesus or not? And then that was followed up with the usually staid U.S. News and World Report, who ran a cover story called The Search for Jesus. Now, you didn't know he was missing, did you? But they say, at least the premise of the article is, we don't know really the whole picture of Jesus completely. We only have what was told us, not what was real. Now, there's a small difference that has a whole lot of differences in that. And then that was followed up by Dan Brown's The Da Vinci Code, which purports that Jesus was just a man who married Mary Magdalene. They had children, many of whom, at least one of which, is still roaming around the earth today. That's the basic premise of the book. And even though it's fiction, it was based upon another work that supposedly was historical, but it wasn't, if you ever read it. And then in 2007, Marvin Meyer wrote a book called The Secret Gospels. You didn't know there was a secret gospel, did you? But there are. We're going to talk about them this morning. This is a book that talks about essays on Thomas and the secret gospels. That there are whole batches of information about Jesus that were never put in the Bible, and the hint is laid for sinister purposes. They don't say it quite that way, but they do say that, the reason these are not in there because they tell you things that you don't want to, that the church doesn't want you to hear. Therefore, the New Testament has been cleansed of all the information you really want to know. I've had the situation before people come up and say, I want to know something. I said, okay, what do you want to know? And they would say, well, just the real truth. I said, so what you want me to tell you is everything that you want to know that you don't need to know. Is that right? Now that really irritated some people. That's okay. It exposed the truth. That was the truth about the secret gospels as well. The question, though, is it's very basic. I mean, yeah, if you reduce everything down to its bare minimum, the basic question of the New Testament is this: who is Jesus and what is he like? If you strain it all out, that's the essential element of what the gospel is all about, why the New Testament was written. In Matthew chapter 16, Matthew writes the account of Jesus asking his disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" And they reply with the popular opinions of the day: Elijah, John the Baptist, Jeremiah, another prophet. Then he points to them and said, "Who do you say that I am?" And it's Peter who brings back the response, "You are the Christ, the Son of God." You see it very clearly right there. When you get to the end of the Gospel of John, John has this little 2-verse appendix, if you will, that tells you why he's writing what he wrote. Now, Jesus did many other signs in the presence of the disciples that are not written in this book. He only has 8 of them, by the way, in his gospel. But these are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing in him you may have life in his name. You hear this. That's the point of the New Testament. That's the reason it exists. The problem is, people say, you really don't know who Jesus is. Now, there's a way to assault the Bible. There is a frontal assault. A frontal assault basically says, we're going to take on verse by verse to prove that this is wrong. That gets really difficult. It gets difficult for a lot of reasons. Number one is because faith and proof are 2 different things, and what satisfies me will not satisfy you. And so frontal assaults tend to be met with defensiveness and a lack of engagement. In other words, the other problem, though, is you can have a flank assault. Flank assault comes around the backside and says, let's talk about something else and tear down the foundation. In the flank assault against the Bible, the way it's done is to say this: the Bible, while it may be good, is incomplete. There's so many things that are missing that we don't have the right answers. We don't have the complete picture. If we had the complete picture, we would know better. But it doesn't present the complete picture, and because it's incomplete, you have to go outside of it to learn what you need to know. That's what happens a lot. That's what's happening today. The Bible's a good book. You ought to read it, but it's not the only good book. There are all kinds of other things over here at the same time. And so let's take a deep dive into a subject that's hard to talk about. This is what prompts all this. Back in the New Testament, you begin to see hints of it. It really flourishes in the second century. It's a philosophical idea called Gnosticism. We've kind of touched on it before. This is a thumbnail sketch. It comes from the Greek word gnosko, which means to know. And so it's that which is based on some kind of knowledge. The knowledge was that God appeared to me and gave me a secret. I have secret knowledge. I have knowledge you don't have. I have knowledge that has been reserved for only the wisest and the most enlightened in the world. Now let me give you an observation. I have never met people who believe they are not the enlightened. Have you ever met anybody that really believes they're going to hell? Not many. And, there are people who say, no matter what, I'm on the inside, you're on the outside. The Gnostic teacher said, we have received a special revelation from God. And he has told us things that he has not told other people, including the disciples, including the apostles, including the writers of the New Testament. Therefore, you need to listen to us because we have this updated vision. The vision had some pieces to it. The biggest part was that people are 2 parts. That doesn't mean they have split personalities. If you've ever met somebody who has one, and I did once, we had a church member who had a ratty little boy, and I mean ratty because he's the one, she would try to shush him in church, and she'd say, shh, shh. I thought the tires were leaking, frankly. But the next week I had to go visit her in the mental hospital down in Galveston because she had, apparently her alternate personality had taken a butcher knife to her husband. Really safe thing to do is to step into a locked unit with a woman who's been accused of wielding a knife against somebody. But that's not what this is about. This is about that all of us, that's what they would say, there are two parts. There's your spiritual part, then there's your body, the fleshly part, the mortal part, the part that feels things, the part that gets hungry, the part that gets sunburned, the part that gets an upset stomach, all those things. That's part of that mortal part. But that spiritual part is way upstairs in your life. And whatever happens in your spirit, the flesh doesn't affect. Kind of a crazy idea. And so there's this idea of body and spirit. It comes out this way today. This is a very popular concept. I mean, you can't buy a better one, if you will. After all, think about this. Whatever I feel in my spirit, whatever's happening in my spirit is untouched by my body, and so I can do anything I want to. I can sin as much as I want, and it will never affect my spirit because they're not the same thing. They're not intermingled. They're not matching. Here's how it comes out today. As long as your heart is right, you can do whatever you want. Really? You know, it's funny. I watch news every once in a while, and there's a guy has killed 3 people, and they always talk to his mother. Why? I don't know. The mother says, he's a good boy. He's not a good boy. He killed 3 people. Oh, but he's a good boy. At heart, he's a good boy. It's a very Gnostic idea, by the way, that's okay. But the problem with when we come to this is, what do you do with Jesus? We say that Jesus is both man and God all at the same time. Divinity and human flesh, God and human flesh. That's what the picture of the New Testament is. If flesh and spirit are 2 different things and they can't touch, then whoever Jesus was in the body wasn't affecting his spirit. Whatever he was in the spirit wasn't dealing with his body. If you're totally confused by now, good luck. That's exactly what false teachers wanted you to hear. It's a shell game played with your mind. So who was he? Well, it came in 2 flavors. They tried to explain this. It's really difficult. And by the way, when people try to explain things, they usually start with their conclusion and go find things to make it happen. I've known this with preachers all my life, where they go, I'm going to preach on this. In other words, they started here. They go back to the Bible and they find the 4 verses that maybe say a little bit about that and build a case about it. Not the best system in the world. And that's what happened here. The first flavor is called docetism. The Greek word means to seem. Jesus was nothing more than an apparition. He was kind of a ghost. He seemed to be human. He seemed to be that way. He really wasn't that way. He just seemed to be that way. He looked the part. He felt like the part. He had the attributions, but he really wasn't human. It was really a great deal. For instance, today we can take holograms, and you can make a 3D image of someone who is dead, and they can talk. In Chicago, the Holocaust Museum had a project there in which they interviewed Holocaust survivors because they were all in their 80s and 90s, and they wanted to get their stories on record before they died. But they put them together as a hologram and put a database together, usually through artificial intelligence, and you can ask the hologram questions and they will respond to your questions. They've been dead for 5 years. How's that happen? It's because they're not really there, but they seem to be. That's what John's trying to fight. By the end of the 1st century, this is a big problem. John says in his first letter, he said, the beginning, he says, that which was from the beginning, which we have heard, which we have seen with our eyes, which we have looked at, and our hands have touched. That's a word that means to handle. It means to grope. It has a very tactile sense. It would be like coming over here and touching this and says, it's smooth, but I can feel the ridges of the grain of the wood, even through the lacquer. It all comes through touch. And so John says, we have touched him. He's the one that tells the story about Thomas. And Thomas who says, unless I feel of his side and of his hands, I will never ever believe. That's how he says it. And so Jesus says, put your finger here and see my hands. Reach out and put it into my side. Very tactile. Something that can be handled and touched and felt. The other flavor of all this was adoptionism, meaning that Jesus was a man but was adopted by the Spirit of God to be the vessel. It's like a vase that has the rose in it. The vase is not the rose is the rose, the vase only carries it. The view was that when Jesus is baptized, as you read in Matthew chapter 3, it says when he was baptized and went up out of the water, at that moment heaven was open and he saw the Spirit descending on him like a dove. There are those who claimed that this verse meant that God entered his body at that point in time, but Jesus was always just a man, but God was in it. So when he died on the cross, as he's about to give up the ghost, by the way, the term giving up the ghost is what they would like, the Spirit of God is withdrawn from him, so just the man Jesus dies on the cross, not God. It's a clever way of trying to put things together. But the premise of the New Testament is that Jesus was God's Son come in human flesh. If you dispute that, if you don't believe that, you can't believe that Jesus is the Son of God. That's a real problem. If you want the Son of God, but he doesn't have to be human. And so, the picture that Jesus is God come in human flesh is not the picture of what we'll call the apocryphal Gospels. They have a distorted view today. We're going to tackle quickly some things that give an alternative view of Jesus. But to do that, we have to go to the deserts of Egypt. Down in Upper Egypt, that's what it's called. In the desert, there's a place called Nag Hammadi. Nag Hammadi is basically what we'd call a mesa out there in the middle of the desert, and it's a long way away from the pyramids or the Sphinx or Thebes or the great places of Egypt. It's out in the middle of nowhere. If you're trying to escape culture, you usually get out in the middle of nowhere. In 1944, archaeologists came to Nag Hammadi and they began to uncover treasure troves of scrolls. And as they read these scrolls, they found out some were very Jewish, some were Greek, but then there were some that didn't look like anything. They told the story of Jesus. 45 documents, all of Gnostic origin because it used all the code words, and they studied them for 32 years and then published them in 1977. I want you to hang on to the 1977 part. Vicki and I got married in 1976. So let me go be very bold. These are not that old. And so they've only been published where people can read them in the last 50 years. It's an important part. And because if they contain the true gospel of Christ, why weren't they available earlier? They are called by different names. The Gnostic Gospels, the Pseudepigrapha, or the New Testament Apocrypha, not to be confused with what we looked at last week in the Old Testament. They have never been published in a Bible, ever. Unlike what we looked at last week where Catholic Bibles have the Old Testament Apocrypha, this has never been published, probably because it didn't come to light until 1977. But even Bibles since 1977 have rejected them. These are really poor versions of it. And there's a reason for that, as we're going to see. There are 8 different Gospels we're looking at here today. If you look at that list, what do you notice about it? They don't mention Jesus at all, okay? What do you notice? You recognize the names? Yeah. Okay. They're gospel. Okay. The Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, those are people we know, isn't it? Yeah. And then there's the Gospel of Mary. Now, it's going to be an interesting one. The secret Gospel of Mark. Mark already has a gospel, but this isn't the same gospel. Or the Gospel of Peter, or I love the last one, the Gospel of Judas. That Judas writes a gospel. Think about that for a moment. The Gospel of Thomas is probably the most well-known. It has 110 different sayings of Jesus. The preface of it says, these are the sayings of Jesus, and then they all start with, then Jesus said. But what they're doing, they do something else. The Gospel of Thomas scratches an itch that people have. We don't like holes in stories, you know it? We just don't. We want to know what happened. You know why there are prequels to movies that were made 50 years ago being made today? It's because, two things, they ran out of material, writers did. But the second is, we like to hear a broader story. We want to fill in the blanks. Think about this. Wouldn't you like to know what Jesus was like as a boy before the age of 12? Did he pick up his clothes from his room? Did he eat all of his vegetables? Did he always say yes, ma'am, and no, ma'am? What was he like? Well, the Gospel of Thomas wants to fill in that blank. It tells some stories, one of which is Jesus is growing up. He's in the carpenter shop with Joseph. Joseph ignores the adage that says, measure twice, cut once. He just goes in, and when he measures it, it's 2 inches too short. Guess what? A board that's too short you can't use. Unless you have Jesus for a son. He goes over there and goes, pulls it back out full length. Start over again. Imagine the economy of that. You never miss any lumber. Another one, he's in a mountain valley. Now this is where the geography part gets, not many mountains are in the area that have things like this. But there's this river that flows, this stream that flows through it. And so what Jesus does, he comes to it and stream into 12 ponds. And as he touches each pond, the water dries up and it leaves clay. And as he does that, he takes the clay and molds it with his hands, and they become living sparrows so he can play with them. Now that's one of the stories that's told there. And it says it's all about Jesus. The Gospel of Mary, for instance, is supposedly from Mary Magdalene. Mary plays an interesting part in the role of Jesus. She's a mysterious woman everybody makes more of than she is. In it, it says that salvation is achieved by seeking the true spiritual nature of humanity. It's a very, very Gnostic idea. It's a very modern idea, by the way. This is a humanist today could write this. That when you reach your fullest human potential, you will have achieved what God made you to be. You know, that's kind of what she's saying there. She thinks that Peter and Andrew were proud, arrogant men who couldn't be trusted, couldn't be listened to, and didn't do anything for the gospel. And that the only true witness was Mary Magdalene, and because the book supposedly was written by Mary Magdalene, you have to believe what she says as opposed to anybody else. Circular logic on that one. The Gospel of Peter, notice it's not the letters of Peter. The Gospel of Peter supposedly talks about the death of Jesus on the cross. He dies on the cross, and then he gives up his spirit, but it kind of portrays he just kind of vanishes into thin air. and nothing left. No resurrection, no ascension, just poof, and we're gone. And there, the secret gospel of Mark, the one that the book was written about, purports that it's about a document. The New York Times, in December the 30th of 1960, as 1961 is about to dawn, they have a headline that said, "New Gospel Discovered." Do you think people will read a headline like that? Absolutely. Do you realize that 3 months ago there was an article in The Atlantic, I think where it was. I read it. It's about a scholar somewhere in New England who claims that the secret gospel of Mark unlocks unlocks truth that we never knew. And he stood by that statement regardless. It's first mentioned in a letter in the back of a book found in 1646. First time it's ever mentioned. And it's kind of pornographic, frankly. It has to deal with Jesus and women, and you can imagine how that might go if you believe in flesh and spirit is different. The secret gospel of Mark also, no copies exist today. You can't find it. The only one that disappeared 20 years ago, and what we've got left is this. That's the photograph. That's the only thing we got. That's the sum total. You're going to build a whole theory around half a page of text that doesn't exist anymore. That's what's interesting to me. The Gospel of Judas. Judas supposedly wrote this gospel. But we didn't know anything about it until April of 2006. That's not even 20 years ago. It purports that Judas was the only one who understood Jesus. That he really knew what Jesus was trying to do. I've heard these things for all my life. He really believed that Jesus was going to be a conqueror, deliverer, and so when Jesus seemed to be pulled back, he forced the point by betraying him to bring out the big guns at that point. Seen kind of the same way. It lionizes the villains of the Bible, by the way. That everybody who is bad is now good and everybody who's good is now bad. But there are three key ideas in here. One is date, one is geography, and one is cultural accuracy. If those three things are not met, in other words, if it didn't come from an early enough date, if the geography was wrong, and the culture didn't match, it can't be accurate. From what we can tell, these don't do all those things. They don't come from an early date, and they sure don't portray the geography. After all, a mountain stream, like you're in the Rocky Mountains that Jesus is walking on, doesn't happen. Cultural accuracy is not there as well. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the four that we know of, they were written a few decades after the events. And for instance, they come from roughly 55 to 90. Same generation. These were eyewitnesses. And so they have some sort of bearing on that. The Gnostic Gospels, though, they cannot have come from before 150. They had to be 100 years later. We know that for several reasons. One fact is that the 2nd century doesn't know anything about them. 2nd century Christian writers never talk about them at all. They don't quote them, they don't allude to them, or any of that. They don't do any of that. Why? Because they weren't in existence yet. Ron?
You would think that these writers of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John would have referenced those books in their letters.
You would think so. Yeah, you would think they would show up somewhere.
Well, the secret book.
Yeah, or they at least try to refute it. There's no refutation. You can't refute something that's unavailable. And so that's part of the problem as well. The other is that most of these books have some quotation, allusion, or parallel to the 4 canonical Gospels. In other words, they're borrowing material or plagiarizing material. They go back to Matthew, for instance, and they'll pull this piece and this piece and this piece, and they'll put it in there and say, you say it must be genuine. No, that's the same problem that a high school freshman has when he goes on the internet and he buys a paper from a paper mill. The teacher will spot it quickly. And if they can't spot it today, you run it through AI and it spots it quickly. So they're using other material. And in fact, the Gospel of Thomas has almost every New Testament book in it. That's got to be late, as we have seen before, because you cannot quote something that doesn't yet exist. I cannot tell you a story out of John Grisham's next novel. Why? It hasn't been written yet. It makes a lot of sense when you look at it that way. The other thing, though, is these don't have the ring of authenticity. The Liberty Bell is what's pictured. The Liberty Bell supposedly cracked tolling at the death of John Marshall, the first Chief Justice of the United States. They tried to fix it. They tried to put a spike in it to kind of bring it together, but it never did sound the same. It didn't sound like the real thing anymore. And so they basically have just made it an artifact. These don't have the ring of authenticity. It doesn't sound right that Jesus lengthens boards out to correct the mistake, or that he makes pigeons to where he can play with them, or that Mary Magdalene knows more than the gospel writers, or that Judas is really the good guy and everybody else is the bad guy, or that Pilate is the one that really needs to be exonerated and make Herod the fall guy for the death of Jesus. All those things, it doesn't have the ring of authenticity. It just doesn't sound right. That's right. I mean, well, and to write that, of course, what they say is what that gospel says. He never really did. They had to get rid of get rid of Judas somehow. It doesn't have that sense. If it doesn't sound like Scripture, it's probably not Scripture. Now be careful, because you can't apply that too badly. If you say it sounds like Scripture, so it must be Scripture, can't do that either. A lot of Benjamin Franklin sounds like that. Stitch in time saves 9. Where is that in the Bible? Sounds good. Sounds like Proverbs, doesn't it? But it's not there. This is important, that there's something at stake here. What's at stake is the central idea of who Jesus really is. Is Jesus God come in human flesh? And if he isn't, then why are what these portraits portray are unnecessary? It was the writer of Hebrews that said, you've got to decide if Jesus was a man who was a good teacher, a moral ethicist, or was he the Son of God? Why? Because we don't have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, who is all spiritual and doesn't know anything about the flesh. It's the first part of that, by the way. But we have one who is tempted in every way we are. There's the physical part, and yet without sin. If you take any of what's being said in the world today about Jesus outside of the gospel, you get a very perverted picture that you cannot trust. And if that happens, you lose the central hub of your faith, which is important.